Hello and good afternoon. Took you a second. Welcome to the 2022 GOTO Summit. There we go. For those of you who are not MBAs, you should know that the MBAs are just finishing their assessment week. They turned in their last assignment about an hour ago. And last night, they had a fantastic MBA ball, which ended at approximately 4 this morning. So it is it's a wonder that any of them are even standing up, much less here. And to all of you who are watching from your sofas at home, welcome, hello, good to see you. I'm Peter Drobac, I'm director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship here at the school, and also the convener of the GOTO course, and that's what today is all about. Before we get started, couple housekeeping things. There's a photo consent form probably in front of you. We ask, because GDPR is a wonderful thing, if you don't mind and if you give your consent, just to fill that out because this is being filmed and live streamed, and then also our wonderful photographer Sam is in the back making us all look not hungover. And we may use photos and things. Of course, if you don't want your photo taken, just make that known and we can sit you off to the back or something. Please fill that out. We're together for 2 hours today, and after the summit, we do have a reception, which is going to be upstairs in the West Wing dining room, correct? Where we'll have some nibbles and a well-deserved glass of Prosecco as well. So please do join us for that. And with that, let's kick off. Welcome, come on in, we're all friends. So, let's get started. I always start with terrible, terrible headlines. GOTO we've really used as a way to dig into, trying to understand what the pandemic means and where it's taking us. And so when we started GOTO this year, in January, we were talking a lot about this new variant of COVID called Omicron. And just as we thought we were sort of getting over and getting past a wave, another one hit, and there was a lot of fear and uncertainty at that time. Since then, a lot has changed as COVID has started to recede a little bit, and a lot of what we were doing to mitigate it has receded a lot, and we're kind of now in this interesting in-between space where we're all trying to feel our way around and get life back to some semblance of normal, but supply chains are still messed up and prices are soaring, and unfortunately, even though we're all exhausted, no one said the pandemic was going to happen when it happened, and no one says that something else bad couldn't happen. So these are headlines just from the last couple of days. There's a monkeypox outbreak here in the UK and in multiple countries. I'm an infectious disease doctor. I have seen monkeypox. It's not something you should be worried about, but yes, my goodness, it's another strange virus that is suddenly emerging in unusual ways. We've all seen, of course, the crisis facing the people of Ukraine, but that crisis is reverberating in ways that are really, I think, instructive all around the world, not least through driving up food prices and creating the possibility of a global food shortage that could really be detrimental, particularly for people who are living on the margins around the world. And meanwhile, we can't forget that the climate crisis is always looming and not slowing down. India and Pakistan are facing the possibility of record heat waves. It's already over 100 degrees Fahrenheit for several days on end. And so all of these things are with us, and all of these things are connected. And this is kind of what GOTO is all about. We're a business school. And sometimes people ask, well, why do we do systems thinking in a business school? Why do we think about the sustainable development goals in a business school? The reality is that whether you care about this stuff or not, and I hope most of you do care about this stuff, this is the reality of the world that we live in today. You can't run or be part of a business without confronting climate change. You can't run a business effectively without understanding the effect on your supply chains and your consumers and the communities that you live in, etc. These are all challenges, the biggest challenges of our time. It's going to require all of us to address it. So not only can you not ignore them, these are also challenges that no government, no single organization, no single business can accomplish on its own. So we believe that business leaders in the 21st century need to be systems thinkers, and in fact, that this can give you a kind of an edge in understanding risks and opportunities and understanding the world in a way that maybe some of your peers don't. And this is an exemplar of that. Peter Tofano, our former dean, helped to start the GOTO program 7 years ago. And the idea here is that in MBA programs, we spend a lot of time talking about management and leadership at the level of individuals, at the level of teams, and at the level of organizations. But what about those wicked problems that transcend organizations, that are interconnected, where trying to make an intervention here may cause an unintended consequence over here? And again, that's the reality of an interconnected, entangled 21st century world. And so that's what this is about. And it's a different kind of leadership that we think complements everything else that goes into a more traditional MBA. You're all familiar probably with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. There are innumerable targets within them. The point here is that all of these things are being affected right now. These are big aspirations for where we want to get to as a world. In many ways, the last couple of years have created some real setbacks for us across the board here. And our students over this term have been working on all of these in some way, shape, or form, which is really, really tremendous to see. And one of the important things I think about the SDGs was that unlike their predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs were really embraced by the private sector and by business, who are taking a much more leading role in trying to address them. So what is GOTO? For those of you who are not familiar with GOTO, like my friend Sarah, who came all the way from Cambridge, because they don't do this kind of stuff at Cambridge. Sorry, Sarah, I told you to put you on the spot. GOTO stands for Global Opportunities and Threats Oxford. It is an experiential team-based course that's part of our MBA and our executive MBA that has students to work in teams trying to think about complex problems and systemic approaches to what are systemic problems. So working together, our goal is to develop skills to confront complexity and wicked problems with humility and courage, using systems thinking to try to apply some of these tools to a real world project that they choose, and that's what the projects we're going to see today. And then to think about how leadership is evolving and what it might mean to be a systems leader in an interconnected world. Every year we have a theme. It's been the future of healthcare in the past, climate action, the future of demography. For the last 2 years, given the pandemic, we did something a little bit different. Rather than choosing one kind of vertical issue, we started from the premise that the COVID-19 pandemic was kind of upending our world and really bringing to the surface all of these deep-seated systemic problems that maybe existed before but weren't always evident to everybody, that exacerbated economic inequality, social and racial inequality, that had impact on the climate crisis, and obviously really devastated in many ways some of our healthcare systems. So the systems reset theme is really broad, and we looked at it across these 4 dimensions. The idea is, how can we reset or reimagine these systems that are part of how we live, and maybe use this opportunity to try to build something more fit for purpose in the 21st century. So economic reset, climate reset, social reset, and health reset. Every team started off in kind of one of these funnels and then identified a project they were excited about within that. And Natalie was one of our advisors. You'll meet Natalie as one of our judges in a second for the health stream. So I want to introduce our finalists and talk about the competition a little bit. This is just for the MBAs, we had 56 teams of 6 students this year. So every MBA in the school, and then 150 exec MBAs earlier in the year, have all dug into real-world sustainability problems in GOTO. And it's phenomenal. We won't be able to get into all of the wonderful projects today, but we will be sharing those as soon as we're able to, so that you can see the incredible breadth of work that was done by the MBA class this year. Out of those 56, there were a number of incredible projects. There were probably too many distinctions, and we'll get in trouble for that, but it was deserved. Ultimately, as we do for the GOTO Summit, which is a chance to kind of share and celebrate at least some of the work that was done, 5 teams were chosen. And the teams were chosen by faculty in GOTO based on effectively nominations by faculty, as well as some other assessments. And similar to what we did during the actual assessment of the course, and we'll talk about this, we weighted a little bit more heavily the feasibility and impactfulness and originality of the intervention idea. As you'll see, a lot of GOTO is actually exploring the system to try to understand the problem in a new way, but we also wanted to make sure that groups were able to carry that through with a change idea that we think has legs. And our 5 groups today, I won't go through the group numbers, and some of them may have given themselves some more clever teams. First off, we have our finalists over here. Let's give them all a round of applause. I can't tell if they're nervous or just exhausted or both. If anyone needs some paracetamol, I'm a doctor. Sorry, couldn't resist. Okay, our 5 finalists. We have Team Wakulima, Collateral Damage of the EU Green Deal. We have another group focused on Kenya, looking at the unemployment gap as it relates to the digital economy in East Africa. We have a team that looked at creating a fair share for cocoa farmers in the Ivory Coast. Then we move back up here to the UK, unlocking untapped potential. How can we increase funding for female founders here in the UK? And then finally addressing the nursing shortage in England, which has been so acute through the pandemic and is worse now than it probably was at the outset of 2020. So as you can see, we kind of moved all over the world. All 4 of those tracks, economic, climate, health, and social, are represented here as well. And the best part of GOTO for me is that it's just fascinating, and I get to learn a lot from all of you. You make us all smarter, and I think that'll be the case for us today. There is real money on the line. MBAs love competition, and so we created a trophy, and there are prizes, and this trophy will sit in the common room with names emblazoned on them for all eternity, all that kind of stuff. The MBAs did amazing in sports and other stuff in the MBAT tournament, so we're just going to keep that high level of competition today. I want everyone to pay attention here, because all of you in the audience here and in the audience online are also going to be judging the competition today, and we'll be awarding real money. So as you can see, the 5 finalists today will be competing for a first place prize, a second place prize, and an audience award. And in addition, every team that doesn't receive a first or second place will receive a commendation prize, because again, this is the final 5 out of 56 really, really strong and talented groups and really excellent projects. The criteria that we'll be using, as the audience, you can use whatever criteria you want. But the criteria that we use is we want groups to be able to demonstrate a really deep understanding of the problem. Why does it exist? Why is it important? How have we understood it? Second, we want them to show how using systems mapping and other systems thinking approach have helped them to understand the problem in new and novel ways. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we want students to be able to tell us what's already being done out there, what's working, what's not, and why, and what can we learn from that. Then the change idea, the intervention idea. What do we think? Where are the leverage points, and where are the places where a little change could make a big difference? And then finally, overall quality of the presentation, the pitch itself, the slides, etc. So those will things that will be factored in, and you can certainly consider that as well. Finally, before we get started with the presentations, I want to introduce our esteemed, fashionable, brilliant panel of judges. Natalie's giving me a look of death. We have Watu Wamaye, Natalie Bohm, and Claire Wathen. Please give them a round of applause. I think your mics are on, so let's just go down the line, starting with Watu, and just briefly introduce yourself, please.
Hello, hi. Is that on? Yeah, it is. My name is Watu Wamaye. I work at the Nuffield Department of Medicine, and I work for an initiative called the Africa Oxford Initiative, where I'm the Research Engagement Manager, and I also run a health innovation platform working with outstanding African innovators from across Africa, doing fantastic work around innovation and health. And I'm also a researcher in economics of innovation. I love anything to do with complex problems, and especially if they speak to structural dynamics. That's me.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you who have been up since 4 a.m. or didn't go to bed till 4. It's lovely to be here. I'm Natalie Bohm. I'm Medical Director of External Engagement at Pfizer, where I run a team of people who are very much dedicated to real-world evidence generation, really understanding the impact of our medicines, both on patients and on systems. I'm a clinical academic by background, with a PhD in health services and policy research. So again, I think understanding how you work with systems and complex problems is an area of real interest. Just for a little bit of explanation of the truly lovely photo that Peter's dug out.
I forgot I did that. Now I understand the look of venom.
I know Peter from swimming, and I think that's at an end of a race, but Peter and I can often be found in the Thames, floating along with the ducks and trying not to drown. So thank you, Peter. I'll hand over to you, Claire.
I love the visual. Hi, everyone. Claire Wathen with the Skoll Foundation. Really lovely to be here with all of you. We invest, connect, and champion in systems work at scale around the world in many different issue areas. And so we think a lot about existing systems, future systems, dynamics of systems, and how social innovators and social entrepreneurs are tackling those head on and bringing others with them to think about more collaborative approaches to social impact. So really lovely to be here and excited to dig into the work that you're doing and think about bridging with our global network, and also excited to be starting a visiting fellowship here and thinking more about interconnection with our world and work and folks with what's happening here in Oxford. So.
Fantastic. Welcome, judges. Excited to have you. And one thing, Natalie, Pfizer, Albert Bourla, the CEO of Pfizer, is speaking here at the school on Monday, I believe. Don't quote me on the date, but it's next week. And obviously been a really important and towering figure given Pfizer's role in vaccine and treatment development over the last couple of years. So it should be a fascinating discussion that I really encourage you to attend. Lastly, I want to introduce Andrew and Alicia from our projects office and programs team. Andrew has been behind the scenes doing literally everything for GOTO all the way through and for this event, so we're very grateful. He will be presenting the audience award later. And I think with that, we can get into it. So we're going to go through those 5 teams I mentioned in that order. The way this works is it's an 8-minute presentation. And they'll be delivered here live, followed by 7 minutes of Q&A from our judges. We'll go through those 5 groups. Slides are being loaded up as we speak. And then we'll have time for judge and audience deliberation. So stay tuned for that. Pay attention. Remember those criteria. And I think we can get started. So I think the first group is Wakulima. Yeah? Welcome. Additional mic here. Yeah.
Yeah, you go.
Good. Right. Hi, everyone. We are Wakulima, which is the Kiswahili word for farmers. Our project delved into the East African country of Kenya, their cash crops export system, and their European trade partners. So what are cash crops? Cash crops include flowers, fruits, coffee, tea, and legumes, and it's a significant part of the Kenyan economy. It contributes $2.3 billion to the total export economy, and that's about 3% of the GDP. Now, 34% of this trade is with Europe, primarily Netherlands, Germany, and the UK. And it's also pretty important to Europe as well. So around 38% of cut flowers sold in the EU comes from Kenya. So it's a pretty important system. Now let's get into Wakulima. They underpin this entire system. They're largely smallholder farmers. They earn as little as $100 a day, and they're significantly dependent on rainfall for agriculture. Now, they've had a brutal few years in the last few years. The pandemic impacted job losses significantly. They caused a lot of job losses. They've been dealing with pests, droughts, low productivity. But on the positive side, they have significant mobile penetration and financial inclusion. Now, one interesting thing here is that one of the most important cash crops that they trade is Kenyan flowers. And the carbon emissions involved in Kenyan flowers in the entire system, 93% of that comes from air transport when they ship it, when they fly it overnight from Kenya to Europe. Now, to this mix, we introduced the EU Green Deal, which is the most important piece of climate legislation in Europe. And we think that this might cause problems to the livelihoods of Kenyan farmers. So our system problem is, how can the EU Green Deal succeed while safeguarding the export trade and livelihoods of Kenyan farmers? Now, when you look at this interconnected, intertwined system, there are so many tensions that are palpable. Two of the most important ones are carbon emissions and pesticides. Let's look at carbon emission. In Europe, especially among consumers, there is a perception that local produce emits less carbon dioxide. However, this might not be a complete system view. If you ask a Kenyan farmer, they would want you to look at the value chain. They would want you to look at scope 3 emissions. In Europe, if you want to grow flowers, you need greenhouses because the temperature is not ideal for flower growth. Therefore, the carbon emissions emitted from greenhouses can actually be more than the carbon emissions in the air transport when you ship them, when you fly them from Kenya to Europe. Now let's look at pesticides. In the farm to fork strategy, which is an important part of the Green Deal, there is a mandate to reduce pesticides by 50% over the next 8 years. However, pesticides are critical for food security in Kenya. There are increasing locust invasions across East Africa, and pesticides are very, very important for that. Moreover, a declining use of pesticides have also led to some of the export rejects being sold in the local market. Now, there are a number of things that the EU and the AU have tried to address this problem. Lots of legalese in there, in those documents, but ultimately no one has really tried to get to the root of the issue. How can these two important interdependent systems continue to progress in a sustainable manner?
So as part of our system analysis, we did a stakeholders map of all of the important players in the cash crop trade ecosystem between Kenya and the European Union. And we identified 3 main types of actors. The first one are the governmental and the public institutions that regulate and influence the trade, such as the European Commission. Secondly, we have the private corporations that are providing some sort of service in this supply chain, such as the retailers in the European Union. And thirdly, we have the farmers and the local institutions that are growing the crops and commercializing those crops. With this stakeholders map, we identified 2 main types of flow. We have the information flow, which is being triggered by the European side mostly, because they are the ones regulating the trade and emitting new legislations that are impacting the Kenyan farmers. And we also have the physical flow, which is a pull system that is also being triggered by the European Union retailers and supermarkets who buy the cash crops from Kenya. So you can see there's a very clear power dynamic driven by Europe in this ecosystem. We also analyzed the mental models that were underlying this relationship, and we identified this overarching principle that the European Union has, that is that the EU-centric actions related to climate will benefit the entire world. And this is rooted in a series of mental principles such as local is greener, there are sufficient resources to adapt, for farmers to adapt to new regulations, and it is possible to obtain a sustainable food supply without any kind of negative externalities. However, we questioned each of these principles, and we were able to prove, based on evidence, that actually the opposite is true. Local is not necessarily greener. We have some cash crops that we can import that are actually greener than local production, such as the flowers that we already discussed. There are not sufficient resources for farmers to adapt to new regulations, and this will impact their livelihoods, among others. So we derived on a new guiding star, which is the guiding principle of our project, which is that the European Union actually needs to develop sources for sustainable food supply outside of the European Union.
This map represents patterns and behaviors that influences issues in emissions and pesticides. So in red for emissions, we see there's the preference for local is greener, and we've already proven that that's potentially wrong. So this leads us to a leverage point around emissions measurement. And then for pesticides, we see the key issue as limited training. So whilst funding and foreign aid does get pumped into Kenya for training, it tends to focus on sectors such as manufacturing, which is thought to generate more jobs. So if we can start investing in sustainable farming and not just yield maximizing farming, we think we can benefit Kenyan farmers in the long term so they can sell more to Europe for a longer period of time. So our first intervention is how can we add emission measurements into the price of flowers? So in the Netherlands, they have the Alsmaar flower market. It's the largest flower market in the world, sells 43 million a day. And they have a current pricing process called the Dutch auction pricing system, which is centuries old and is desperate need of updating. And luckily for us, the Rotherham School of Management is doing a project currently where they're looking to add data and analytics into the pricing mechanism. And so we want to piggyback on this existing project by adding carbon emission pricing into the cost of the flowers. So we can use technologies such as blockchain to track emissions from Kenya all the way through to the auction house, and therefore we can price in the cost of this carbon externalities. And really, we think this is going to benefit Kenyan farmers because the price of their goods will be more competitive than Europeans, and therefore they'll be able to sell higher volumes and sort of maintain their jobs and their wages. Thank you.
Our second intervention is around pesticide mitigation. We believe that with the right support, Kenyan farmers can reduce pesticide use so that their products can continue to compete in the European markets. There is research showing that reducing pesticides can actually lead to higher agricultural yields. And in fact, EU farmers have access to online free training resources so that they are supported in that transition. Unfortunately, Kenyan farmers don't have access to those tools. And so pesticide mitigation reduction techniques are less widespread among the Wakulima. We propose that the EU make their training resources available to all trade partners, not just Kenya, which will enable under-resourced producers to continue to innovate and compete, and will also promote long-term food security for Europe by enabling sustainable agricultural development abroad. We see two ways for Kenyans to access these tools. First is on mobile. Naga mentioned that mobile penetration is strong among the Wakulima. And so farmers who have access to mobile connectivity can access trainings on their phone and then implement changes at home. And the second way is going to be through a training of trainers scheme, recognizing that not all farmers have internet connectivity, and even those who do might prefer to receive training from trusted leaders and partners. So representatives from each community will go to Kenyan training centers, which already exist, receive the training, and then be ambassadors in their communities to further pass on the training. Thank you very much.
It's over to us, I think.
Do you want to begin?
I'm happy to start. Thank you very much. Really interesting, very complex problem. I'm curious in this, and this is possibly comes from my own background, where I know that you can develop lots of evidence and gain very little traction. To my mind, one of your key stakeholders that you need to think about is your buying public. And how are you going to actually translate what is fairly complex evidence around carbon emissions along the value chain, complex, difficult to develop or even agree on? How are you going to translate that, or think about translating that into a message to those stakeholders that actually buy the products at the end of the day? Because the model isn't going to work if people don't buy it because they're so convinced that local is greener.
Well, today the evidence in Europe is shifting towards local is more green, towards local and seasonal. So that's the idea we want to anchor here, is that seasonal crops are more green efficient than sustainable, not alternative. So if we bring, for example, flowers that are raised in spring in Kenya to the EU when it's winter, actually the people will realize that this is more greener, sustainable than the alternative.
I'll just add as well that we did think of the consumers and realized exactly what you said, that would be extremely difficult to focus on that as an intervention. And that's actually why we focused on those other two interventions, so that we can factor in those costs at the point of purchasing of flowers, for example, rather than rely on changing consumer behavior, which is much more difficult.
Thank you, Wakulima. I found this very fascinating. There was good framing in terms of understanding the background and also in terms of bringing out the tension. And I think the interventions are a very strong start. What I did wonder is you had put out the fact that, for example, I think I read somewhere it was saying flower emissions in Kenya, even after transportation, is much lower than flowers grown in greenhouses in the Netherlands. And I think you were onto something there, but you dropped it because you're up against a mindset that is saying local is greener and better. And it may well be the case that the greenhouse emissions coming out of Kenya, their contribution to the EU is pretty much significant. And there might be a very strong story there, even before going to the Rotterdam School of Management to create all sorts of carbon emissions, to actually make this alive in a very interesting way. Now, my question is, you may want to comment on that, but I did wonder, because the whole world is trying to become greener anyway, and I can see that your interventions, especially with the pesticides, is sort of moving in that direction. What is your thinking in terms of, in quotes, leapfrogging? So in other words, developing countries don't have to pollute as much as industrialized countries to become industrialized. There might be ways to actually circumvent all that. What's your thinking on that?
Absolutely. So in Kenya is a great example for that, because in terms of financial inclusion, they absolutely leapfrog many other countries because they have access to M-Pesa and other models like that. So in our view, the entire opportunity that is posed by blockchain is a very important part of this entire system. Because if you use blockchain to actually convert something that might be very complex, like flower emissions, and use that entire blockchain technology in order to convert that into economic value, I think that's one way for Kenyan farmers to clearly say that what they're making is better than what the Europeans are making. Because economic value is a very easy way for people to see that value up there. If something is cheaper, then that's a significant indicator right there. So we think that blockchain technology in general can be a good way for the Kenyan system to leapfrog several other systems in this respect.
I was curious if you could speak a little bit more about how the levers are interconnected from a timeline perspective. There are some immediate changes that could shift the current dynamics given the gaps in the system that you've named. How do you see that compared to medium and longer term shifts, and what, from the perspective of the key stakeholders, primarily the farmers, would be success in that?
Yes, so that was actually the criteria that we used in order to prioritize the interventions. The two interventions that we chose are already related to programs that are occurring at the moment, such as the research that the University in Amsterdam is doing, and such as the changes that we are proposing in training. They are also piggybacking on the training solutions that already exist. So we see those two solutions as being in the short, middle term. And we also propose a series of other interventions for the long term, such as creating a brand around the Kenyan produce that is greener than local produce, based on the information that we already have on emissions based on the blockchain implementation. So yeah, the two interventions that we proposed are short term, and then we see other ones in the long term to strengthen the brand of Kenyan produce mainly.
I don't have anything else, do you, at this point?
Thank you very much. We're staying in Kenya, and the next team is coming down. It all worked out great, but I neglected to mention that Andrew here will give a 1-minute warning in your presentation and a 1-minute warning for the Q&A. Microphone.
Thank you, Professor. Spot on. It's the wrong one. Which one do I click here? Up and down? This is great. That one, and then back. How do I go back on this one? There we go. Little lagging. Okay, fantastic. Are we ready? Great. Perfect. So, as we've mentioned, we basically, from an economic perspective, on the economic track, we decided to look at a problem that we could solve in an emerging economy. We chose Kenya, and we actually looked for a problem that's got a big social impact, but that we can actually solve with a climate solution. So trying to tie a few things together, and we actually settled on how do we actually increase the participation of the Kenyan youth within the digital economy. So if we maybe start with Kenya and just a bit of a lay of the land, we know that in Kenya there's about 70% internet penetration in the country. Nairobi's a big part of this, with a lot of ICT infrastructure and a lot of innovation happening there. We also know that the youth, specifically, that 59% of the youth have secondary education or above and are basically part of that system. But if you look at it on the flip side, we know that about 5.5 million Kenyan youth are actually unemployed. This is about a 40% unemployment rate in the youth unemployment space, which is quite large. We also know that 53% of those that are employed are actually employed in agriculture. There's also the stat that about 24.5 million youth will actually be entering the workforce in Kenya over the next 15 years, with only 100,000 new jobs being created on a yearly basis currently. So as you can see comparatively, with the US, for instance, having an 8.3% youth unemployment rate, stark difference. The digital economy actually contributes 8.2% of the US GDP, which is a meaningful number. But the most important one is this actually accounts for about 86% of labor productivity, which we think is something that can be driven. It's maybe good to pause over here and just think, what do we mean by the digital economy? We know it's quite broad, and certain people might have a different understanding of this. And to the bottom left, as you can see, what we've settled on is to say the digital economy, as part of formal employment landscape, includes the delivery of goods and services in country as well as internationally, underpinned by ICT infrastructure to enable the effective delivery of these goods and services. So if we step to the systems map, and as you can see, this is quite complicated and quite convoluted, and Claire will take us through this a little bit more, but what we've tried to do is to say, where do we actually start? And how do we move someone who's looking to graduate, looking to move into formal employment all the way through until they get a job? Things that we focused on specifically would be, how do we shift the paradigm of the youth's role within the workforce? How do we actually evolve goals within the system of just saying we need someone to be employed? How do we actually generate positive feedback loops? And how do we actually structure the system to actually help with all of these structural problems underlying this to get into a system that is actually functioning a lot better? I'll hand over to Claire.
Thank you. So what we've seen is that under the current paradigm, youth are practically responsible for making their own employment without the enabling supports to help them do it. So they've been passive recipients of an education system that was designed for the 20th century. And when they try to find work, they need to go through additional training or upskilling programs like TVET or coding institutions, often at their own cost. And afterwards, there's rarely funding available to help them start scalable, sustainable businesses or get directly connected with local or international employment. And the resources available to them to do this are often limited to the resources in their family or community, which is land for subsistence farming or very small businesses. And as a result, this pathway to employment really grinds to a halt. Up to 75% of youth are not employed for a year. And if they have a job, it's often by their families in agriculture and in subsistence farming. And only 20% of youth are employed by non-family members. So there's really not a pathway to allow them to access formal, sustainable employment that can drive real benefits for their community. So we can go to the next slide. And current policy and behavior within the system will only continue to restrict youth's pathway to sustainable employment. The goals are designed to maintain the status quo. The transition to a new 21st century education system has been extremely slow. It's still very outdated. And government is investing in increasing informal employment as opposed to creating more jobs. Political stakeholders change direction only if there is a financial incentive. So right now, aid often comes in because of the poor employment rate and the desperate situation of youths. And infrastructure comes when foreign stakeholders pay for it. International tech companies who could bring in jobs are disincentivized to come in, often because of rigid and outdated tax policies. And players that are trying to enter the youth market and trying to implement resiliency measures like home solar systems can't roll out because it's very difficult to reach youth, especially in rural settings. And there's a lack of relevant skills of youth to be able to participate in those types of jobs. So I'll pass it over to Meghana to talk about some of the models here.
Thank you. So what we did was we tried to dig deep into what might be causing these problems that we see on the surface level. And as you see, the biggest problems you see on the surface level was that on a patterns level, you see the rural youth are underutilizing the government supports and schemes that are existing. There's also large-scale employment among the university graduates. These are the people who have finished their education. And then there's a significant portion of youth that are resorting to crime and violence for petty cash and becoming henchmen for the politicians. There's also a large number of high school dropouts, which is inexplicable. So we dug deep a little more into the structures, existing structures, and tried to identify what might be causing these problems we saw on the surface level. And first thing is that some of the government's schemes, such as KYEOP and KKV, are myopic in strategy because they create short-term employment, which doesn't solve the issue of unstable and livelihood insecurities, which is why youth resort to taking smaller jobs, secondary source of income. That's why they resort to crime and violence. And there's also the fact that a lot of these support schemes are inaccessible to the youth in rural areas because they lack the digital literacy to even access these things. And to dig deep, there were a lot of cumbersome processes for people, for the youth to even get to universities where, and this is the sort of people we are talking about who don't even have birth certificates available. And then what we did was we tried to dig deep into the mental models that might be causing these structural issues. And we saw that one of the things is most of the schemes are addressed to one homogeneous perception of youth, which is why, which kind of doesn't consider the lack of digital literacy or the geopolitical situations they might be in, which is causing all these problems. And then, sorry, we can move on to the next slide. So what we see here is what's broken. Oh, intervention, okay.
Yes, so in order to turn around the whole situation, we believe that the best way to do is to enable Kenya to become a tech-enabled self-employment hub, technology hub for the East African region. And in order to achieve that moonshot, we believe that it is important to do that step by step because it's a very complex goal. In the first step, what we want to do is to leverage on the existing resources, which is the land resources that this youth and the family have. So we would partner with solar companies locally to enable these families to install solar panels locally, and then enable these Kenyan youth to become an entrepreneur in their own district. And second phase is about upskilling, because like after they have learned about how to run their own business in the local region, we then will partner with upskilling agencies and local businesses in the country. Okay.
You can read the rest. Thank you.
Go on.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Again, a very important problem here that you're looking into. The youth bulge is massive, and it could become an opportunity if well canalized, or it could become a massive threat. And the idea of actually thinking about a tech hub in Kenya is actually building on what already exists. There's traction there, so that's very useful. I had a number of questions. So the solution here you're suggesting is to think about solar energy, and again, fantastic, because we're talking about green economies and so on and so forth, and coupling that with technology and the fact that 53%, so you had very compelling statistics. What I did wonder is, so digital economies, when you talk about a digital economy, you're talking about enablers. At the end of the day, there is the real economy that depends on hardware, like hard infrastructure. In fact, when you talk about solar energy, you're talking about solar panels, you're talking about mini grids, and these rural areas, as far as I'm aware, are not that well connected in terms of having the mini grids and so on. So the idea is interesting, but it's also a very expensive one, even if in the long run one can see the green benefits. So I wondered how, the other point that was also made quite poignantly was that the schemes that already exist for the tech staff, the youth are not even using these, and there was no real explanation why that is happening, and why would they hop onto this other new suggestion. And then there was also a mention of high school dropout, and then it was mentioned that it's inexplicable. I actually don't think it is. I think, in fact, your storyline tells why that might be the case. So anyhow, I'll leave that with you to think through and perhaps comment.
Okay, great. So if we go back to the last, can we go back to the last slide? So I think your first comment was around how expensive it's going to be to actually like produce the hardware to do these like micro solar farming. So what we were thinking is there's already a lot of companies that are doing this in Kenya, like PowerGen and RV Solar are doing the microgrids, and then I was actually just trying to Google some of the names because obviously I forgot them, of the people that are really empowering home solar systems. But some of the problems that they're facing, and like they're already bringing the equipment, they're already deploying these systems, trying to deploy the systems around the country. But some of the problems that they're facing are that people don't know how to fix these systems, and so they have to send out their own, they have to train and send out their own people to be able to install, fix, and run maintenance, and even collect payments for the systems. So what we're proposing is partnering with these types of companies and saying, instead of trying to find people to go out to the communities and do this, why not get the youth who are there and who may be managing the systems to train them to do it themselves? So in that way, it's more of a distributed implementation network rather than more centralized, which is what a lot of people are currently doing. And then your second comment was, dropouts and how it's inexplicable. I think I worked in ed tech in Kenya for 5 years, or for 7 years, excuse me. And so one of the things that's very challenging is that families of secondary school students and youth, and that I'm sure we all know very well, like also don't have a lot of money. So there is a very strong pull to drop out earlier on to start creating an income to take care of yourself and your family, because the incentive of completing your education just really isn't there, because there aren't jobs. There's not that direct pathway to formal employment. So by creating, and also the education system isn't providing very relevant skills either. So by giving youth like an actual ability to do more productive and sustainable and potentially scalable entrepreneurship, and the skills that will help them not only conduct that business, but maybe access other additional skills and jobs as well, we think that'll hopefully solve a problem of that inspiration of being able to see that their effort will actually result in employment that sustains them. And you had one more question, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just want to ask a bit of a follow-on question from that last point, because I think there are some social barriers and assumptions that are being made here. And, you know, I think it's very easy to talk about the youth, and you've talked about this isn't a homogeneous group. Are you aware of any work as to that's been done on a sociological basis about what the youth want? Do they want jobs in a digital economy, or are they quite happy with the status quo because they know it and it's easier?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
no, they're not happy with the status quo. So in my work previously, I was running an ed tech startup that was focused on providing digital skills training, especially vocational training, to young people. And a lot of the things that we found is that like people are just hustling and they're trying to get by. And a lot of people, some of those hustles are things like doing, like the Amazon micro jobs, like editing papers. People prefer to have digital jobs because there's more international opportunities. Like there are more jobs, like even on Upwork. My co-founder is one of my CTO, did a lot of international like tech development consulting because there just aren't opportunities in country. So I think by like being able to open up those opportunities and like respond to the diversity of what youth want, like will really help just see that there's a variety of jobs that they can get.
I mean, that's a great piece of understanding to have in there, because I think that's a real enabler of change.
Yeah, definitely.
And then my second question was around some of the policy aspects of this, because you talked about some of the governmental and policy barriers, and the one that I circled here was tax policies. I guess, coming from industry, that's can be a pretty big barrier. And where is the intervention there that can happen to help some of the governmental and policy shifts?
Yeah, do you mind if I keep going? Okay, great. Yeah, so the government, the Kenyan government is just trying to generate revenue as much as they can. Right now, only 7% of formally employed adults are making more than $1,000 a month. So it's basically 7%, and they're taxed at a 30% rate. So that's basically a couple million people are sustaining the entire 50 million wide population. And so to try to get the short-term gains, a lot of times the government will implement things like the digital tax, saying any business that's operating online in Kenya, be they like Amazon or Netflix, well not Amazon, but Netflix, people writing blogs, people selling things all over Instagram have to pay a 1% tax. In addition to whatever sales tax, et cetera, that they have to pay, which is very restrictive. So by giving them additional ways to get revenue, we think that could help open up some of the policies a bit. Thanks, guys.
And that's it for Kenya today. Umefanya vizuri wanafunzi? That was for you. So we're now moving west to the Ivory Coast. I see chocolates. Microphone, clicker.
Is this working?
Yep, right.
Yep, okay.
You people are acting like you've never seen chocolate before. Looks like it's coming around. Please do try to give attention to the group. Thanks.
Well, yeah, we're ready. Great. Oh, well, thank you. The chocolate that is being distributed right now by Rowan was produced by Tony. And this chocolate is intentionally designed into unequal split portions to represent the inequity in the compensation structure of the chocolate value chain. How do you feel right now for the ones who are actually taking a smaller portion compared to the people right next to you? How would you feel? Imagine this. How would you feel being the farmer, producing, harvesting, planting the cocoa beans to produce chocolate and not getting enough value back for your work? Today, we're going to present our findings concerning the inequity in the cocoa value chain for farmers in Ivory Coast, as well as a set of interventions aimed to reform the compensation structure for the value chain in general. And why Ivory Coast? Well, West Africa's economic development has been drastically improving, and farming is actually one of the main reasons. However, Ivory Coast, a country of 6 million people that produces 40% of the world's cocoa output, it still has high poverty rates. Farmers get only 6% of the value of their total production. And why inequity? Well, inequity in the compensation structure is part of, it aggravates income disparity and poverty. And this in turn is the root cause for other problems such as child labor, massive deforestation, as well as modern slavery. We base our findings on a third research, on a third research, and we'll now present our findings to you, and as well as our recommendations. Thank you.
So as we crafted our stakeholder map, we noted that since our farmers are typically small plot farmers in rural locations, they're incredibly reliant on a network of middlemen known as pistors, who collect and transport the beans to a central location. The product is then traded on international markets by commodity traders. Finally, chocolate makers buy the raw material and turn it into finished goods, which are ultimately enjoyed by the consumer. As we translate this more simple view into a more complex system stakeholder map, we see the complexity of the interactions involved. Given the previously discussed farmer characteristics of low bargaining power, lack of physical and digital infrastructure, and little price transparency, it's easy to see here how a farmer could quickly fall behind and get taken advantage of as others flex their muscle to extract more value for themselves.
So what has been done to actually solve these problems? Over the years, many stakeholders in the cocoa industry have been attempted to tackling these issues. From making sure that the cocoa bean used to produce the chocolate itself is coming from sustainable and reliable resources by traceability and certifications, and farmer field school, and also using minimum price by the government, and also using drone technology and local chocolate factory. But as you can see in this slide, each intervention has its own challenges and obstacles, which prevent them to actually make a significant impact in order to improve the cocoa farmers' quality of life. We use these existing solutions analysis to better understand the condition of the cocoa industries, and also we learned what's not working, and why is it working. Moreover, we also compare cocoa to other commodities research to actually learn on how their success story can be our inspiration for us to construct our interventions.
Thank you. We use the iceberg model to look beyond the overt symptoms of poverty and unemployment to truly understand the structures and mindsets which were at the root of this problem. And what we learned was astonishing. This was a systemic issue, and there was no single actor or factor which could have been singled out as the root cause. So we created the next best thing, a systems map, to understand how the various stakeholders were interacting and influencing each other. What we learned was that poverty and unemployment in neighboring Burkina Faso was creating a push factor for parents to pawn off their children across the border to cocoa farmers in Ivory Coast. This led to an oversupply of laborers, depressing the wages, economy 101. These farmers then compete for land for cocoa farming. Now, land in Ivory Coast is limited, So the farmers resort to deforestation of protected biosphere reserves. This unchecked production leads to continuous oversupply of cocoa, depressing the prices even further. These farmers have no access to capital or to technology, and hence completely depend on pistors, who are the intermediaries in this cocoa value chain. And guess what? We all know who commands the maximum power in a value chain claims the maximum value unless checked, which brings me to the government. Our research suggests that the government is benefiting illegally from the entire value chain because the pistors pay a cut of their spoils to the officials, who become lax in implementing minimum support prices, minimum wages, and the forest laws, thereby completing this vicious circle where the farmer, though, is toiling very hard in the fields, but ain't really getting the fruits of its labor, in this case, quite literally.
Thank you. So to work towards fixing the issue, we began by reframing the current reality, by recalibrating our lenses towards a situation where farmers get a fair wage, where there's proper infrastructure, where there's a thriving agricultural ecosystem, and where they're informed consumers, we can prefer solutions. So we have anticipated a couple of obstacles in the provision of these interventions, some of which exist naturally and also some imposed by potentially negatively affected individuals. So we split these obstacles into 3 different divisions based on how they operate, and they consist of everything from the absence of physical and technological infrastructure required to give the farmers access to the marketplace, all the way to the resistance from chocolate makers to pay the fair price, which we already saw by some large chocolate companies like Mondelez and Hershey's, who are alleged to have circumvented the living income differential imposed. So to combat these obstacles, we think that it's important to make the point to all of the parties involved that it is better for everyone it's better for everyone in the industry for the farmer to earn a better living income. The Ivorian head of industry already attested to the fact that farmers were splitting their land and moving more space to the production of rubber, which has lower operating costs. And if these farmers move more into rubber, that reduces the supply that's available, and that it eventually moves the price up. So the point to be made here, the point to be highlighted here, is that a controlled expense today will avoid an uncontrollable loss tomorrow. That then leads us to what our actual interventions are. We decided to start with a major intervention to be supported and bolstered by sub-interventions, which will be implemented over a broad time spectrum. So our main intervention is to provide a fintech, provide and deploy a fintech platform which will be used by farmers to increase their access to the marketplace. Which will be used by farmers to increase access to the marketplace, to provide secure instant payments, to give access to real-time price information, and also to provide working capital. We already have examples of this in Mexico and in the US with Albert and with Verco, which exists, but for the general marketplace. We expect the structural and attitudinal problems that we mentioned in the previous slide to affect these implementation, but we expect to engage with the government to make sure that the benefits of providing the supporting environment and infrastructure are highlighted to them. We'll also be supporting the aforementioned with sub-interventions, which include creating a farmers cooperative, which will be used to increase the bargaining power of the farmers, to leverage the CSR funds of companies so that it can be used to preserve the biosphere reserves. Thank you.
Thank you, that was wonderful, and always never enough time to cover the work that you've done. I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the systemic context. A lot of the presentation was oriented around improving the existing system and what all the different altitudes of that would be for cocoa farming, but you've also mentioned rubber and other alternatives. So I'm curious, regionally, are there other systems at play for this audience of farmers? Are you thinking about other ways to complement and improve? And is it unidirectional, or do you see complementarity there?
So, yes, I agree. I think there are a lot of complementarities here. Because it's a systemic issue. I mean, unless we change the consumer behavior, unless we create awareness even among the chocolate manufacturers, even among the stores, and write their incentives, get the governments in place, and get them working on what actually they need to implement, this is not going to get solved. And that's why it's a wicked problem, right? And I think Javi will share an actual example where this has worked. Javi, would you want to share that?
Yeah, So exactly, one of the research that as Masita was telling, there are many systems that have been trying, that people and governments have been trying to apply, but they have not been successful. And there's a really interesting example in Mexico that is called Vercor. And okay, so this fintech platform, one of the main things that they do is that they try to connect not only through the platform, but also through education. And that's one of the main things that we're thinking about. Obviously, we will need a lot of tweaks, and we will need actual like in-place exploration to be able to understand the tweaks that we will need to do to the platform, right? But still, that plus the supporting. Where is it? Can you go to the previous slide? Sorry. The interventions, the previous. So that plus the previous, the supporting interventions with our creating farmers cooperative, trying to leverage the power from the chocolate big players, as well as trying to decentralize the supply chain and actually leverage also consumer interactions from outside Ivory Coast to help this process. I mean, that's like the whole context to be able to work for through our objective. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you again. This is a massively wicked problem here, and really trying to get to grips with improving livelihoods of marginalized communities. Now, agriculture is a very interesting space because it tends to be highly concentrated in terms of the big players, and you're suggesting big players here, and supply chain decentralization. And your fintech platform definitely could go some way in terms of the corruption, the middlemen, etc. Again, it's an enabler, but there are big blocks that I see around these big players. And it's not entirely clear to me how these big players would want to give away this space. And perhaps you can say more about that.
Okay. So just like you said, the big players, the middlemen, the chocolate companies, they definitely will not be in a hurry or be very happy to give up the space. But the point that I highlighted earlier is very important. The fact that farmers are not earning a living wage and they're suffering and they're only earning about 5 to 6% of the value chain profits means that they're going to continue to use harmful practices and going to continue to move more of their farmlands into producing other things which will be cheaper for them and which is more sustainable for them. And if that happens, everybody in the sector is going to suffer because you're going to have naturally a reduction in supply, and there's nothing that shows that demand is going to wane anytime soon. That reduction in supply is going to affect the global prices of cocoa. And if they don't do anything about it now, they're going to be worse off later. So it makes more sense for them to, I mean, that's the persuasion point, the fact that there's a bigger problem with not doing anything about it now by just biting a little bullet today.
We interviewed a chocolate manufacturer who shall not be named. And he said that while that vertical back in India wanted to source responsible cocoa, they actually didn't have the authority back in India because the headquarters was somewhere else to actually make that decision. So unless the organization structure changes, unless that decision-making power comes back to people who want to make that change, nothing's going to change.
Just wanted to say thank you for the chocolate. That was very persuasive. And where is it gone? Because I have some more of that. Yeah. Just a quick sort of technical question, because I know nothing about your fintech platform. But can you tell me a little bit more about that and how your average farmer there would access it, if there is the infrastructure there for them to utilize it effectively? Do they need training for it? Are there some practical implementation issues there that you need to think about?
So I'm going to start and then Deji is going to complement. It's a very good question, thank you. Actually, the thing is that we're also expecting the government to be part of this, the whole process, like it's a set of interventions, right? So we'll need also some funds from the government and also the players, maybe, I don't know, a private company that is going to supply this fintech platform. Apart from the support from the government, they would need to also support the communities through technology enablement to be able to train them on how to use it and actually escape this hole that they're right now in, right? So yes, it's like a various actors trying to implement this platform to be able to help these communities, especially with education. But for example, Vercor in Mexico, it's a platform that is extremely easy to use. You only have to use one button, and that gives you pretty much the credit that you need. Obviously, there is a person that is going to come to you and check if you can actually pay back. But they have a set of standards, and we believe that taking these standards to Ivory Coast with these farmers, it could be a very interesting way to actually handle this problem. And I don't know if you want to.
I mean, he's already covered most of it, but I just want to add the fact that the Farmers Cooperative is going to be part of driving the education. That's part of why they're there, not just to help the bargaining power of the farmers, but also to provide that education to the farmers. And like he said, it's a very easy platform to use, so it shouldn't take too long to implement.
Add one more thing there, if that's all right, but we were actually comforted by the fact that in doing our research, it turns out that in an effort for the Ivory Coast and Ghanaian governments as well to combat this minimum price per ton, I think it's $2,600 for the cocoa beans to be implemented, digitization is actually one of their main levers. And I've been fortunate enough to work with a firm that operates in a company that operates in northern Ghana, and they also like digitization, and they push payments to their farmers, smallholder farmers, so yeah.
Thank you very much. We didn't plan it this way, but having the chocolate come around in the third presentation was probably just the boost we all needed. As the father of a 6-year-old and 8-year-old, if I ever experienced unequal portions of chocolate, the sky would fall, the mountains would collapse into the sea, and hell would literally freeze over. So I'm glad they're not here. Thank you very much. We are, come on down. Just getting your slide set up. So now we're moving to a different part of the world, a lot closer to home, and in some ways I think kind of a similar problem. And so it's going to be really fascinating to hear from our next group. You've got your microphone, you've got your clicker.
Hello. Hi everyone. Could you all please stand up? Please. All right. So just imagine all of you are founders of amazing startups in the UK, and all the men in the room here, you've gotten funding. Congratulations, billions of pounds. You can sit down. All the women, your ideas are great, but I'm sorry, there's no funding for you. Please sit down.
Only 1% of VC funding went to all female-founded teams. This is in comparison to 90% that went to all male-founded teams. This is a massive missed opportunity for the UK economy and society. This is a problem of, firstly, access, females not being able to access the institutions and the individuals that are giving out that capital, and also of receipt. The females founders are just not receiving that cash. This problem represents a £250 billion missed opportunity that the UK economy could benefit from. Next slide.
Our research reveals with this gender funding gap, there's a race and class dynamic as well. So with women of color and working class women, they're less likely to receive equitable funding compared to white women, white middle class women. A study finding in 2020 that 9% of all funding went to white women as opposed to 0.02% to black women. And there's also a dearth of intersectional data as opposed to the US, which is a slightly more progressive market in that regard. So the point being, if there's no light shone on the issue, there's very less likely to be action. So also, this is a missed opportunity for the UK with a McKinsey study, 2020 McKinsey study finding that more competitive businesses in terms of race and gender, businesses in terms of race and gender that are more competitive in that regard outperform their counterparts by 35% and 25% respectively. And there's also a COVID-19 dynamic with female-founded businesses tending to be more affected by COVID. Next slide, please. So from a macro lens, we find that there's the importance of investing in women has many layers, 4 factors that I'm going to highlight. From an economic lens, the 2021 Rose Report revealed that there's a £250 billion gap, missed opportunity for the UK economy. From a social lens, a 2018 IMF study found that women are more likely to invest in society as opposed to men. From a political lens, funding equity leads to more female founders who are more likely to have flexible working hours for people, which induces normative change. And finally, from an environmental lens, BNP, a 2021 BNP Paribas study found that women are more likely to be environmentally conscious than men, with 54% more likely to be interested, seeing carbon footprint as a priority as opposed to 41% of men. Next slide.
All right, so there are several different types of funding mechanisms available to female founders. However, those that choose to follow the institutional routes face the added challenge of pitching to and working with predominantly men. So in the UK, only 10% of all senior positions at PE and VC firms are held by women. Furthermore, only 20% of the banking sector is female. Regulatory bodies do exist with the goal of increasing gender parity in this industry. However, these organizations have only had minimal success thus far. Access to funding for female founders is further challenged by their networks, which tend to be smaller and less financially oriented than those of their male counterparts. In an industry where who you know can be the difference between getting a meeting or not, this is an added challenge for women. Similarly, since many women tend to create products for other women, that those who do manage to get a meeting face the added challenge of getting a room full of mostly men to fund a product that they might not understand. Thus, it is absolutely critical for more women to be on the funding allocation side of the table. If we look at the startup lifecycle within the UK, it's evident that male-dominated formal financial institutions are involved in every step of a founder's journey, beginning at the seed stage. Thus, at nearly every funding stage, women face the added challenge previously mentioned. Accelerators do exist to help founders attract funding, some of which are focused on females exclusively. However, those who participate must face the barrier of getting accepted, and then even then, future funding is not a guarantee. Next slide, please.
So there are various group of stakeholders involved, and we map them based on 2 things. Firstly is the power, and secondly is the structure. The more power a group has, the more probable they are to drive change within their sector. But depending on their level of structure, some groups might have more bureaucracy and therefore inertia compared to others. So how do these stakeholders interact with each other? Next slide, please. We came up with a holistic view of the women entrepreneurship funding system. And we focus on the journey that women face from being women in a society, getting into entrepreneurship, and eventually getting funded. And analyzing the pattern and relationships, we break it down into 3 key subsystems that affect each stage. Firstly, we have the social system. The issue here is that there's still so many women that are being discouraged to become entrepreneurs. This could be because of their family demands, social media influence, or even just even the academic institutions. Secondly, we have the human capital system. Here, although there are some women that actually become entrepreneurs, within the supporting industry, there are still a lot of barriers for women to become decision makers in that area. This could be because of the culture, network, or sometimes they're just double standards. And finally, there's the financial capital system. Women-led startups receive only a small share of funding because there's still a stereotype that women-led businesses are mostly for a niche market, risky and unattractive. Observing all these elements of these systems, we believe that there is a lack of feedback loops, positive feedback loops, and there is a need for reconfiguration of power.
The insights that we got in the solution we came up with is that we need more women in capital allocating positions because decisions are made at the seed level of funding where VCs. Thank you so much.
Would love to hear a little bit more about the solutions that you have in mind to kick off our question answer section.
Thank you. Okay. So what we found out, we interviewed 15 investors, entrepreneurs, and what keeps coming up is that at the seed level, VCs make decisions based on the founder. And when most of the people make the decision are men, they tend to trust men. So these are not like structured funding rounds. Basically, you go out for a beer or you go for golfing and then or swimming, and then you give money to your friend. So what we actually need is we need more women in the finance industry. So we have like the theory of change that we came up with, which is the last slide, which is to start young, get women interested in the finance industry, make the finance industry more attractive or like accommodating of women who or like family life basically, which will lead to like more women becoming capital allocators, but also like men in investor positions, seeing women as equals, and the whole definition of what a leader looks like will change. Which will lead to more women getting funding and thereby like more women going out for looking for funding. And our final solution is not like 50% of investment should go to women. It's that ideas should be judged on its own merit, and investors should see founders' skills regardless of gender.
I just have one quick follow-up on that. You talked a little bit about the dynamic on the side of the funding. I was curious if you had a sense of the landscape of gender on the entrepreneurial side of the equation. Like, what are the amount of men versus women entrepreneurs? What scale, is there a scale difference of the size of their enterprises, the seed level that they're funding? Like, is that another layer of the skewed system?
So there's a bunch of research behind this, and just like off the top of my mind, women, when we go and ask for funding, because we know that we're less likely to get that money, we usually ask for less. And so because we have this humility in order to, well, if I ask for less, then maybe I'll get more, then men at the other side of the table is like, well, maybe she's not that ambitious. Maybe that's not such a scalable project. And then if you do get that very basic funding, when the next round comes, then you are underfunded and the project cannot be scaled at such a big level. And we also did some research as to there are a lot of projects that encourage entrepreneurship now that are only targeted to women, and the problem is not really there. Women exist. We already have these great ideas. The problem is more of the actual investment. Why isn't the capital going to them? We have the Spanx industry that men they didn't believe that we would pay for such a product, right? And now it's a $1 billion industry that only women understand. So it's more about getting women into the decision making in the capital allocator.
And I think just to tie on to the question, I think the whole problem actually needs to be completely reframed. So it's very much viewed as like, oh, this is gender inequality, but it actually needs to be reframed as actually this is a really big missing opportunity for the whole of society and the economy more generally. And this can no longer be seen as just like a female's problem, but it's actually a problem for all men across economy and society as well.
I'm curious, have you looked at other systems where they've tried to implement these sorts of change, or other, maybe not entrepreneurship, but I think, I come from a STEM background. There's been a lot of work on women in STEM and that sort of thing. Have you looked at where there have been other solutions, either through different types of work or in different countries where it's worked successfully?
Yeah, I think we explored the solutions quite a lot, and I think it's something that we need to start ingraining in children from a very, very young age. So there's been quite a lot of research about, we bring up boys and their favorite color's blue and they're superheroes, and we bring up girls and they've got a doll, and they're taught to be caregivers. So a lot of the solutions and potentially how we would address this would be through education and like really building, we discussed a lot building networks of networks. So getting females interested in finance at the age of 13 and really building like the whole mentoring system and networks from a young age so that you're not suddenly leaving university at the age of 21 and as a female you look and see the finance industry as potentially intimidating, but that's something that you've been learning about and has been very much ingrained from an early stage.
Yeah, I'd like to follow on that. Can I give you some feedback? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I quite liked the setup of the missing 250 billion. That's a very useful way direction to go, beginning by illustrating that. And I also like the fact that you unpacked the intersectionality and showed that women of a certain class are able to do better. And a very interesting piece of information about women of that class having 20% more returns with 50% less. That's really, really powerful. And I wish you had said more. But the part I really wish you could say more about, even right now, is about networks. You talk a bit about the clubs, you know, the boys' clubs and all the rest of it, etc. And you talk about the formal networks. If we were to set aside the formal networks for 1 minute and think about the informal networks, I think there's something there to think about. Because it's in this sort of, you know, backslapping, you know, hi there, you know, buddy kind of thing that people do after work when they go to a pub that seems to be going. I happen to have some sort of experience in this area, whereas women are running home to do homework and put children to bed. Yeah. And also the fact that women tend to sort of interact slightly differently, not that it's better or worse, they tend to go narrower and deeper in their relationship compared to men who go broad and, you know, all that backslapping thing and so on. So, so there's something there about informal networks that I wished you had said more about.
Yeah. And it was definitely part of our solutions. We just didn't really time it perfectly to get onto it. But yeah, I mean, do you want to speak to that, Ash, as well? The networks.
I think it's great feedback and there's not much.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And as we've got our last group coming down, how about just a shout out to our amazing female decision makers here today? How great are they? Here's your microphone, there's your clicker, and your slides are up. Welcome.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening. I would like to start by introducing our team. So my name is Ahmed and I'm joined here today with my colleagues Stephen, Kavya, Yoshi, and Shenzi, and Hunter, who unfortunately cannot join us today, but he's joining us online. So basically we started our analysis with an overview of the shortage of healthcare workers globally and how it impacts the sustainability of healthcare national systems. Then we focused our attention on a particular part of this global system, which is the shortage of nurses in the UK. This slide, I'm trying to show you the scale of the issue. So the first chart on the left-hand side shows how bad the situation is in different parts of the world, which indicates that it's a global challenge, which requires a global system-wide solutions. Narrowing down to the UK context, the chart in the middle shows the nurses' density, which is basically the number of nurses per 10,000 people, and it has been declining annually in the UK on an annual basis. The last chart on the right-hand side shows that in the UK, 80% of all nurses are employed by the NHS. And this is why we as a team decided to focus our attention on the English NHS. Narrowing down again to the English NHS, and through research, interviewing many people in the system, we came to the conclusion that it's an attrition problem rather than a supply problem of nurses to the system. So we know that nurses are leaving the system, which leads to the question, why are they leaving? And the data shows us that 61% say they're not doing the job they wanted to do. More than half are saying that they are spending more time on administrative duties rather than actual nursing duties. And 60% simply say they're not getting paid enough.
So then we used one of the MBA frameworks to understand
what are the factors that affect the motivation for the nurses. We noticed that job fulfillment, flexibility in the role, and money and financial benefits were the top three. And we spoke to people in the industry, and they attested to that as well. So based on that, we wanted to understand where it lies in the whole system. And we mapped the system, and it was super complicated. We divided it into 4 levels: the societal level, the government level, the industry level, and the individual level. If you see if you take any point, most of it is connected to at least one of the other color circles as well. So we realized that social perceptions feed into the policies, policies feed into the overall outcome of it being poor government funding, terrible pay, and inconsistent career trajectory. We then dug a little deeper. We wanted to see what the mental model shows with respect to what the nurses are feeling, why there's a general dissatisfaction. Once again, it attested that poor pay, working conditions, and terrible long hours and no incentives were contributing factors. What more we realized is that it was a thankless job in comparison to that of doctors, and it was a feminine job which lacked fulfillment, and it was expensive and difficult to get through training, not just in the beginning, but also as you were progressing in your career.
So after we mapped the system, what we ended up doing is trying to look at existing solutions to the problem. And what we found is the existing solutions focus more on nurse attraction rather than attrition. So basically making sure that their workplace environment is a nice place to be. So what we can see in the existing solutions is we have government training grants given to nurses so they can go through university, but it's actually not solving the nurses who actually want to leave. On the non-governmental side, we have recruitment agencies who are now bringing in tech to match organizations with carers, but fundamentally the business model hasn't changed. They're still taking a commission on the nurses' shift rate. They're charging very high rates. And it's just a tech-enabled solution to something which doesn't make too much of a difference. So going on to the next slide, we see there's levels of challenges that we need to address before coming up with our own solution. And mainly this is to do with the politicized nature of the healthcare system in the UK. We have 2 differing governments. We have the Conservatives and the Labour Party, and what we tend to see is the level of support for training, for example, is much higher with a Labour government and then reduces massively with a Conservative government. So over time, what we need to do is we need to be able to make sure that all these stakeholders are on the same page with whatever solution that we actually implement. So our solution is something called Care Hero. What it is, it's a moonshot goal, and I'd like you to think about it in terms of an idea rather than a kind of technology platform or anything like that. It's the idea that the individual as a carer is valuable in society, and that's who we need to provide care for, basically ourselves. As an idea, it is 3 pillars. It's education reform with different paths, different routes and specialisms in nursing. We have an evolved career path, so nurses throughout their career journey would be able to develop the skills and go into the areas where there is an increased need for nurses. And finally, there's positive workforce development, so a platform which allows nurses to kind of create communities, create rapid teams, and importantly, provide support to each other throughout their whole career journey. We see this idea as a solution which has to be implemented across all levels. It needs to have input from the private sector, from the governmental sector, from educators as well. Ultimately, by doing this, we can fundamentally ensure that the supply of nurses matches the demand for nurses in the UK and solve this global issue which was outlined at the beginning of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm absolutely thrilled to see that someone's looked at what is an incredibly difficult issue, and I do not envy you having to map that out. I'm going to ask you one very basic question to start out with. And can one of you please tell me what the job of a nurse entails?
Yeah, the job of a nurse entails lots of different things. You would expect that the job of a nurse would be very practical, where they'd be changing catheters, for example, or taking bloods and kind of supporting the doctors in the long-term care of a patient. But fundamentally, what's happened is there's a shift. So they've gone from providing the practical care to a more bureaucratic, form-filling sort of type role. And that's one of the things that we noticed in our interviews with nurses, one of the issues that they had in terms of job satisfaction.
So one of the things that I would say about this presentation, thank you for that, is that you've used the term nurse like it's a homogeneous population, and we've talked about those before today. Nurses fulfill many, many different roles within healthcare, from the highly specialized ICU nurses, and when you talk about things like job flexibility in that place, there isn't flexibility there because it's so much training. It's like being a consultant physician. Down to, or not even down, because I don't think of it as hierarchical, the nurses who work shifts on wards and cover much more basic stuff. So I'm quite curious to understand how you've understood the complexity of the nursing role within these wider issues for your solutions.
So essentially, when we spoke to people, we realized the issue that you just mentioned with respect to how complex certain roles are. But even those complex roles were made to do administrative job. They were made to do certain things that were not required for, say, a clinical assistant in an ICU is made to do. So we realized, so that's why when we were mapping out our solution as well, one of the things that we were focusing on was to understand where each of those roles stand and how we can train them to move forward in those roles or deviate into other roles. So we did try to map out each of their job KRAs, but it is a massive industry, like you said, and it was, the more we spoke to people, the more we realized that there were some roles which had interloops with other roles, and that's what we tried to do in our systems map as well, because it's really hard to put down that, these are the 5 things that a nurse does in a particular space. Somebody who might be working in a clinical space would, in turn, might sub for a space which is in ICU on certain situations because they are trained for that as well. And that's where the massive training costs go, because they're not just trained for one thing, they're trained for multiple things. And that, again, we feel is redundant in some way, because if somebody wants to join a role in, say, the floor level, and they want to grow in the floor level, they should be trained for that. So the cost would significantly reduce then. So that's what we're trying to do with Care Hero as well.
Yeah, to build on Kavia's point, also one of the innovation that we try to bring with Care Hero is usually we think career paths only vertically, never horizontally. That also applies to the specialization of the different nurses as well. Through our research, we found in England, the biggest gap in terms of vacancy is in mental health nurses, so it's a big gap. But we never thought about horizontally. Some of the nurse, actually, we can reshift them and re-upgrade them, reskill them into some of the other nurse specialization we need. So Care Hero, because we want to actually use the basic common shared data, we can actually know from the front line where the gap is, so we can feed back into the school and provide more modular training rather than very traditional training and give nurses 3 years of the thing they will never use in their job. Yeah.
This is a long-standing, very complex challenge. And I have to congratulate you for grabbing the bull by the horns, because this is almost massively frightening. And I think you've done a good job. I think your approach was very refreshing. I quite enjoyed the attraction framework and bringing that, into perspective for us. And I just want to know a little bit about your solution. So you talk about the Care Hero, and you talk about how you might work with education, recruitment, and human capital management. But in your mapping, which was very helpful, one thing stood out for me. You talked about societal perceptions and how these feed into policies. And then you also did a scenarios planning that was very interesting. And there you picked out for the positive scenario something around health-conscious population. So what I'd like to hear a little bit more is if you could say a little bit about the societal perceptions and then how you ended up talking about this positive scenario of health-conscious population, because it seems very important and somehow not properly connecting with the Care Hero solution you suggest.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the experience of COVID, especially over the past 2 years, has created a massive opportunity. So what we have and why we talked about a health-conscious population is because the world has just gone through a global pandemic. People have been cooped up in their homes for 2 years, and now they're actually wondering, they're reassessing what they want out of life and actually their health as well. So it's a massive opportunity for, is that time? Massive opportunity in terms of this kind of culture shift and this reframing of ideas for governments to then fund projects like Care Hero, for example, have that public input, which will then fundamentally assist the idea of Care Hero, which is every carer is a hero. And actually, when you saw the NHS clap for carers, that's just an example of how, in the UK specifically, people changed their perception of nurses during the pandemic.
Hopefully, quick question. Have you looked at the other changes that might be needed around the nurse path? And everything here seems it's very much about bolstering the ongoing experience and trajectory of anyone that's in this role. But are there changes that need to also happen for that to be sustainable? Even if all of these things are true, if nothing else within the, for example, medical or hospital system changes. Okay.
That's a really good question. Yeah, what we talk about is rapid team formation. In COVID, actually, they went to a flexible working system with doctors going out in the communities. So it shows that it can be done. And actually, that's probably going to be the solution going forward. Nurses working from home, having more of a flexible work-life balance, taking care of children and other needs and things like that. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and congratulations to all the finalists. We're through our 5 presentations. And now, this thing is really heavy. Press the trophy. So our former colleague, Fraser Boyd, worked really hard on designing this trophy, and he was so obsessed with this trophy that he wore white gloves whenever touching it, and he wouldn't let anyone touch it without wearing literal white gloves. So I hope I'm not smudging it too much here. This is the trophy that awaits one of you. At this time, we're going to ask our judges, along with Andrew, to retire for their deliberation. So they're going to step out of the room. We'll give them a moment, and then I'll explain what happens next. Okay, so if you haven't already seen it, and for those of you online, if you look at your screen, it's time for the audience vote. So you go to menti.com. I'm sure many of you, I know all of you students are familiar with Mentimeter. And then you enter the code, which is on the screen here. It's 49316355. It should be a very straightforward survey. Where you just have one question to answer, where you select the team you'd like to vote for the audience award. So take all the time you need, because the judges will probably need a few more minutes than we do. If you have any problems with Mentimeter or with the survey, just say the word. I'm sure the finalists are voting for a different team, just, you know, out of politeness or whatever, right? All right, listen, we've got a few minutes. The judges should be back a little bit before the top of the hour. At this time, I think since we've all been just sitting for a long time, apart from Asha standing us up and the chocolate we've been fed, if you need to step out and take a comfort break, grab a drink of water, check your email or whatever, let's just mingle for a bit. And let's say at 5:02 we try to come back into our places. 5 minutes before the hour, just to make sure we beat the judges back. All right, everybody. Let's take our seats. The moment of truth is near upon us. I'm going to hand it over to our esteemed judges here. Natalie, take it away. You're all mic'd?
Yeah, I think so. Yep, good. Well, first of all, a huge thank you to all you guys who presented. I mean, there's a huge amount of work there, fabulous presentations, great chocolate, you know, honestly. Everything I could have asked for out of this. And it was really, really tough for us to come to a decision. Poor Andrew was there going, come on, guys, you're going to have to speed up, you're going to have to speed up. And I'm like, no, we got to talk a bit more. I think as a sort of, as a general comment, one of the things we were really looking at was the end-to-end piece with this. What ties the theory, the mapping, the statement of the problem, through to that golden thread as to what the solution is. And that has to be feasible. And I think, you know, it's quite easy to get trapped into some of those details and stuff, but of course, with a really good presentation, and some of this was about presentation, you have to have that clear story from end to end. We have to see how that flows. So I think although everything was, you know, was very, very detailed and well thought through, and everyone did a lot of work on this, there were some clear standouts for us at the end of the day. As a general comment, I would also say, when you're dealing with complexity, and I think, Peter, you would agree with this, and I know we've talked about this, it can be tempting to look towards not easy solutions, because none of them are, but towards the solutions that look good now. And there's some universality to solutions that you always need to think about. So I think that sort of drove our thinking at the end of the day. But really well done. It's been a real pleasure to work with some amazing women up here. And a big thank you to Peter for inviting us to here. I don't know, Watu, Claire, if you wanted to add any further comments into that?
Yeah, just a small one. So digital technology and the digital economy is here to stay. It's not going anywhere. We have to embrace it. But I think it's very important not to forget that at the end of the day, behind all that are behavioral complexities. And it's very difficult to shift mindsets. So sort of unpacking that and, you know, getting under the skin of that is very important. And then linking it to where, you know, digital technologies are at, because they don't just happen randomly. They try to latch on to existing behaviors. So getting that well connected and that joined up is likely to be a more winning formula.
And just to round out comments, I think we also reflected on how there's many altitudes involved when doing this kind of work, starting with the big forces, the levers, the movement, the traction, what's sticky, what's moving, all the way down to individual stakeholders. And as you're sort of starting big and going down into the system, it's also important to look back upwards and remember that system is a fancy way to say people in places doing something in some way. And what's been going on before, as well as what could happen in the future. And so sometimes all of the levers that you can design when you're looking into a system don't need to be changed. Sometimes it's about looking at the weight of levers to say the one thing that we want to focus on is this, and the people and the influences right around that one lever to move is X, Y, Z, and so that's the strategy and focusing in to prioritize. So just thinking about how to balance all of the things that you can map. Many of you mentioned the maps are very complicated as they are, people moving and constantly in motion, and how to balance that with the structure. So just wonderful to learn more about the work, and was trying to also read the deeper context in your materials as you were presenting, because there's never enough time in this setting, but just wonderful job all around.
Yeah, well done, you guys.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for coming. And for those of you attending online, thank you as well. Not only attending, of course, but participating in the vote. And the first of our votes for this afternoon, I can tell you, with Democracy in Action, that it is Unlocking Untapped Potential have won the Audience Award. Please.
Please. Come on up, come on up. There we
go. That's for you. Congratulations. Congratulations. Thank you. Congratulations. Congratulations. You're fantastic. Thank you. Well done. Well done. Well done. Great.
Thank you. And now we're back to our judges to announce the first and second prize. As a reminder, the other three teams all win a commendation, have already done so, but we'll hear the second prize, then the first prize.
Do you want me to? Okay. Right, so it was tough, and it was a big decision, but the second prize today goes to Wakulima. It's a big thank you. Come on in.
Thank you so much.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, guys. Well done. Do you want to announce first?
Oh, okay.
Go on.
Oh, wow.
Go on.
Oof. I probably need a glass of water to announce the first prize. Drum roll, drum roll. And be mistaken not, all the 5 presentations were very strong, thorough piece of work, but we felt that the team that sort of just edged forward a little bit ahead of the others was female founders.
Wow. What drama. Congratulations again to all of the finalists. Truly, truly phenomenal job. Really, really proud of you. I'm really proud of you. I know it's been a long term and change. And this is just a reminder to all of you, on the MBA that, in many cases, we hope that GOTO is just the beginning. Obviously, we hope that you'll take some of these skills forward, but I know that lots of you are really passionate about these topics. And so as you think about what happens next, how to give back, how to share what you've learned with organizations, with communities that have given their knowledge and expertise to you, and if you actually want to put these ideas into action, that all of us are here, and I think I probably speak for the judges and all of my faculty colleagues in saying that we're behind you and want to help you do that. And to all the faculty who have been involved, there's about 24 people involved in putting on GOTO every year, some here and online. Obviously, we're deeply grateful to you, and GOTO wouldn't be anything without all of them, as well as Andrew and Alicia. And one final thank you to our judges. We really did well this year on the judge front. Okay, so we're going to close this phase of things, and retire upstairs to the West Wing dining room. Is that the Pyramid Room? Yes. To the Pyramid Room, for those who know. We'll kind of all go en masse for those who don't know. We are totally welcome for a reception, for more celebrations, and more photos. Thanks.